The house was quiet in a way that felt wrong, the kind of silence that presses against the ears and makes even daylight seem unwelcome. From the outside, the home looked like any other on the street, curtains neatly drawn, toys once scattered now tucked away, a place that blended easily into its neighborhood. Inside lived a large family that many professionals believed they understood. Files were written, meetings were held, assessments were made. And yet, behind closed doors, a very different reality was unfolding. At the center of it all was a little girl named Emily Carter. Emily had been known to authorities from the moment she was born. Concerns followed her first breath, raised voices in hospital corridors, tense conversations between social workers, notes carefully typed into official systems. Her parents, Daniel Carter and Laura Miller, were young and volatile. Their relationship shifted constantly between reconciliation and conflict, leaving Emily caught in the middle before she could even speak. In her earliest years, Emily moved back and forth between households. Sometimes she lived with her mother, sometimes with her father. Each transition was marked by promises: this time things would be different, this time the environment would be stable. Professionals tried to weigh risk against hope, believing that with guidance and monitoring, the family could function safely. Daniel eventually formed a new relationship with Rachel Turner, a woman who presented herself as calm, organized, and capable. Together, they built a blended household that appeared structured on paper. When a custody decision placed Emily primarily in Daniel's care, it was framed as an opportunity for consistency. At first, Emily's school saw a quiet child who followed rules and rarely complained. But over time, staff noticed changes. She became withdrawn. She flinched at sudden noises. Her smile faded. Teachers documented small injuries, nothing dramatic, nothing that could not be explained away. Still, concerns were raised. Emails were sent. Meetings were scheduled and then postponed. At home, Emily's world was shrinking. Rules multiplied. Punishments grew harsher. Ordinary childhood behavior was met with strict control. Gradually, she stopped seeing friends. Phone calls were limited. Doors closed, both literally and figuratively. The adults insisted they were simply being firm, that structure was what Emily needed. When questions were asked, reassurances were given. Eventually, Emily stopped attending school altogether. The explanation was vague but accepted. Oversight weakened. Visits became less frequent. The file remained open, but the picture was incomplete. Inside the house, the pressure continued to build. And no one outside truly understood what Emily was enduring, until it was far too late. As weeks turned into months, the concerns surrounding Emily never fully disappeared, they simply lost urgency. Social workers rotated. Emails went unanswered longer than before. Each time someone new reviewed the case, they saw fragments instead of a full picture: a child who had once been considered at risk, now living in what appeared to be a settled home. Reports described Daniel as cooperative, Rachel as attentive. There was always an explanation ready. Inside the house, however, Emily's life followed a rigid pattern. Her days were quiet and tightly controlled. Meals were eaten in silence. Mistakes, real or imagined, were met with severe consequences. She learned quickly that asking questions made things worse. So she stopped asking. She learned that crying brought punishment. So she learned to stay still. Rachel took the lead in discipline, insisting that Emily needed correction. Daniel supported her, rarely questioning the methods used. Together, they convinced themselves they were shaping a better child. Emily's injuries became harder to hide. Bruises were covered with long sleeves. Explanations grew repetitive: clumsiness, accidents, rough play that no one else ever witnessed. On the rare occasions professionals saw her in person, she stood quietly beside the adults, eyes downcast, answering only when spoken to. School staff noticed her absence more acutely than anyone else. Emily had once been punctual, eager to please. Now she was simply gone. When inquiries were made, the response was vague. She was being educated at home, they said. The paperwork lagged behind, but no immediate action followed. Isolation became complete. Extended family had little contact. Friends were no longer allowed. Even medical appointments were avoided unless absolutely necessary. The household became a closed system, sealed off from outside scrutiny. Within those walls, the atmosphere grew tense. Punishments escalated. What began as strict rules turned into something far darker. Emily's body bore the weight of it, and so did her spirit. She moved carefully, spoke softly, and tried desperately not to draw attention to herself. There were moments, brief, fragile ones, when someone almost intervened. A phone call that raised questions. A note in a file suggesting a follow-up visit. But nothing came fast enough, or thorough enough, to break through. The system believed it was watching. In reality, Emily was disappearing in plain sight. And as the days passed, the danger inside that home grew closer to a point of no return. By the time autumn arrived, Emily's world had narrowed to a few rooms and a handful of rules. Mornings began before sunrise. She was expected to be awake, dressed, and standing quietly by the kitchen doorway. Any delay was met with sharp words and consequences she had learned to fear. Rachel kept meticulous control over the household, enforcing schedules with an intensity that left no room for softness. Daniel rarely intervened. His silence became its own form of permission. Emily learned to read moods the way other children learned numbers. The sound of footsteps, the tone of a voice, the way a door closed, each detail told her whether the day would be survivable or unbearable. She adapted by becoming smaller, quieter, nearly invisible. But her body told a different story. Marks appeared more frequently now. Her movements became stiff. She flinched when spoken to. On the few occasions she was seen outside the home, neighbors noticed how thin she looked, how her eyes seemed older than her years. Still, no one pushed hard enough. It was easier to believe explanations than to imagine the truth. Behind closed doors, discipline had crossed a line long ago. Punishments were no longer about behavior, they were about control. Emily was blamed for things she did not understand and made to feel responsible for the adult's anger. Over time, she stopped defending herself altogether. Records later showed that concerns were noted again during this period. A professional flagged the case for review. Another suggested a visit. But staffing shortages, scheduling conflicts, and assumptions delayed action. Each delay allowed the situation to worsen. Inside the house, tension escalated daily. Rachel insisted Emily was difficult, defiant in subtle ways. Daniel agreed, repeating the words until they felt true. Together, they justified harsher measures, telling themselves they were correcting problems before they grew. Emily's health declined, but medical care was avoided. She was told she was exaggerating, that she needed to be tougher. When pain became impossible to hide, she was punished for complaining. The remaining children in the house learned to stay silent. They watched and absorbed the rules: do not question, do not interfere, do not attract attention. Fear shaped everyone differently, but it shaped Emily the most. By winter, the house no longer resembled a home. It was a place of tension, secrecy, and constant pressure. And Emily, already fragile, was being pushed beyond what any child could endure. The breaking point was approaching. No one outside the walls knew how close it was. The final weeks unfolded quietly, without sirens or alarms, without anything that might have drawn attention from the outside world. Inside the house, the pressure had reached a dangerous intensity. Emily moved slowly now, conserving energy, her small body clearly struggling. She spent long periods alone, confined to spaces where time felt endless. Meals were inconsistent. Sleep came in fragments. Every day blended into the next, marked only by commands and consequences. Rachel insisted Emily was pretending, exaggerating for sympathy. Daniel echoed the sentiment, convincing himself that acknowledging the truth would mean accepting responsibility. Their certainty hardened into something unmovable. On the day everything changed, nothing seemed unusual at first. The morning passed in tense silence. The house felt heavy, the air thick with unspoken anger. Emily was already unwell, but she was expected to comply as always. When she failed to meet expectations, frustration erupted. What followed was brief but devastating. Later, the adults would struggle to explain it. Words like discipline and loss of control were used. But none of those explanations could undo what happened inside that home. Emily collapsed, unable to recover. Panic followed, but not the kind that leads to help. Instead of calling for medical assistance, the adults hesitated. Fear overtook reason. They discussed consequences, whispered arguments unfolding while Emily lay unmoving. The decision they made in those moments sealed everything that followed. They did not seek help. Hours passed. Then more. By the time they accepted what had happened, their focus had shifted entirely, to themselves. Plans were made quickly and quietly. Bags were packed. The remaining children were gathered and told little. That same day, the family left the country, crossing borders with rehearsed calm. Only once they were safely away did they contact authorities, delivering the news from a distance. Back home, officials entered the house expecting uncertainty. What they found instead was clarity. Emily's body told a story that paperwork never had. Injuries showed patterns, not accidents. The signs spoke of prolonged suffering, of harm repeated over time. The truth, once undeniable, hit with devastating force. The house was sealed. The case shifted instantly, from concern to investigation. And the failures that had allowed Emily's suffering to continue for so long could no longer be ignored. The search for the adults began immediately. Border records confirmed what investigators feared: the family had left the country within hours of Emily's death. What had once been a domestic welfare case was now an international investigation. Alerts were issued. Warrants were prepared. Behind the scenes, agencies worked together to undo the distance the adults believed would protect them. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. As details emerged, anger spread through the community. Teachers replayed every moment they had questioned and every time they had accepted an explanation. Social workers revisited notes with shaking hands, realizing how close they had come to intervening, and how far they had fallen short. The system had not just failed, it had fractured. Months later, the adults were located and returned under heavy escort. Daniel Carter appeared withdrawn, barely speaking. Rachel Turner remained composed, her posture rigid, her expression controlled. A third adult in the household, Michael Reed, was also charged, accused of knowing what was happening and doing nothing to stop it. The courtroom was silent when the trial began. Prosecutors laid out Emily's life in painful detail. Medical experts explained injuries that could not be accidental. Patterns were drawn. Timelines were reconstructed. The narrative was unavoidable: this was not a single moment of harm, but a sustained campaign of cruelty. Witnesses spoke of missed opportunities. Emails were read aloud. Reports were examined line by line. Each one revealed how concern had been softened by assumptions, how urgency had been diluted by procedure. The defense offered explanations but no answers. Discipline, they said. Stress. Misjudgment. None of it resonated. When the verdicts were read, there was no surprise. Daniel Carter and Rachel Turner were convicted of murder. Michael Reed was found guilty of allowing Emily's death. Sentences followed swiftly, measured in decades, heavy with finality. There were no cheers in the courtroom. Only quiet breathing, and the weight of what had been lost. Emily's name was spoken often during those proceedings. More often than it ever had been while she was alive. Outside the courthouse, calls for reform grew louder. People demanded change, not just accountability for those who caused harm, but for the system that failed to protect a child it had known since birth. Reviews were ordered. Policies questioned. Promises were made. But for many, those promises felt too late. Emily had needed safety, not hindsight. In the months that followed the trial, Emily's name became inseparable from a national reckoning. Independent reviews were launched to examine how so many warning signs had been missed. Reports detailed gaps in communication, overstretched services, and decisions that relied too heavily on appearances rather than patterns. Each finding added another layer to a truth that was already painfully clear: Emily had been visible to the system, but never fully seen. Changes were promised. Procedures were rewritten. Training was expanded. Officials spoke publicly about lessons learned and responsibilities renewed. Some of those changes would go on to protect other children, but they came at a cost that could never be repaid. A memorial was held quietly, attended by those who wished they had done more. There were no speeches about forgiveness, only about responsibility. Emily was remembered as a gentle child who loved drawing, who tried hard to please, who deserved safety and care. The house where she lived was eventually sold. New families passed through its rooms unaware of what had happened there. But for those who knew the case, the address would always carry weight. Daniel Carter, Rachel Turner, and Michael Reed disappeared into the prison system, their names fading from headlines. Emily's did not. Her story was cited in training manuals, policy discussions, and courtrooms, not as a statistic, but as a reminder. A reminder that danger does not always announce itself loudly. That silence can be misread as stability. That waiting for certainty can mean waiting too long. Emily's life was brief, but its impact was lasting. And her story stands as a warning about what happens when responsibility is shared by many, but owned by none.